What is up, amigos? Today we're talking about the aerodynamics of this car here. This is the 1960 Abarth Monoposto record. Now, this comes at the request of one of you amigos, user Tubular2, and this is because last week we went through the aerodynamics of this Mercedes car. This is a concept car. And one of you amigos, you said, well, this car has a drag coefficient of 0.17. This car has a drag coefficient of 0.20. So strangely, this car, even though there are quite a few features on here which are not very aerodynamic, has a lower drag coefficient than this car, which looks very streamlined. Why is that? Today we're going to go through why that is exactly. We're going to go through the different aerodynamic components of this car. So first up, we actually can get a very good idea as to why this has a higher drag coefficient than this car by looking at the functions of these two different cars. So I should note that both of these cars actually have a very low drag coefficient to begin with. This car here was designed in 1960 or made in 1960, and it has a drag coefficient of 0.2. That's really low. So even though this is 0.17, they're both really low still. So this car, but they're for different purposes, and this car here is a concept car. It's really been designed to show what an electric car can do in terms of range. It's trying to overcome that age-old problem that people have in their minds where, oh, if I get an electric car every 3 kilometers, I'm going to have to, sit around and charge my car up for 3 years or whatever and then get back on the road. So they designed this car literally to be as low drag as possible, so it can go as far as possible. They made it to like 1,000 kilometers on one single charge, and they wanted to make it look good. So that is not really a functional car. This is more just for range. They don't care about downforce, they don't care about speed, they don't care about cornering or anything like that. This car, on the other hand, is a racing car. So that's a very different function. So immediately now, actually I can tell you that this car set a bunch of different records when they set it out to race. They made like they made a world record in the top speed over 2,000 miles, the average speed over 2,000 miles, 3,000 kilometers, 5,000 kilometers, I think, and 10,000 kilometers, as well as the average speed over 24 hours, 48 hours, and 72 hours. That was all like around 200 kilometers per hour on average across this range. That's insane. So this car was literally traveling at about 200 kilometers per hour the entire time. And so this is a racing car. As such, they do care about the drag to reduce it, but there are other components as well of the car to balance, such as the downforce. So why is that important? Well, because we're racing and the faster you go, the greater the vertical force will be, whether that's up or down. So if the vertical force is up, that is obviously lift. And if you then start to travel at like 200 kilometers per hour, you're producing a lot of lift, and that's actually going to lift the car off the road a lot. And that can result in a lot of stability problems. For example, you can spin out in corners, or you can even get airborne and flip over. That has happened. So you actually want to reduce the lift and potentially make some downforce to keep you on the road. And that way you can also go through the corners faster and keep that top speed high. As such, the car here is also designed to produce downforce. You can see by the shape, which we'll go into in a little bit. But just straight up, we know that because this car is not just about reducing the drag coefficient, it is also about increasing the downforce, really. So because we are using the flow to do something, we're using its energy. As such, right there, you're behind the 8 ball. You're going to be using this energy, and you're going to produce a little bit more drag. And the way to look about this is you have upstream more energy in the flow, downstream a little less energy in the flow. That is drag then being produced. So no matter what, this car is already at a deficit because of what it is designed to do. But let's go through a bunch of different of these aerodynamic features here just to explain what is happening. So the very first thing that is very obvious is just how streamlined it is. I mean, you can see that all these things that are poking out, they are blended into the body very nicely. You can see the wheel, for example, which we'll go through a little bit more later on, but also the cockpit, and it comes down and it blends in quite nicely, which we can see in this picture here. Everything is nice and smooth. Now, in addition to that, we also have the tail flicking up. So this is effectively the diffuser, and that means that the flow is coming along the underbody here, being shot up, and that's going to increase the downforce. Now, the nose of this car is a little bit interesting. So to begin with, you might think that because this is coming down, this is almost like a reflex wing where the leading edge is cambered down, then it sort of zigzags back up. So it could potentially increase the lift that this is producing, not the downforce, but unfortunately the lift. But we also have to remember that this is in a ground effect kind of situation. this underbody is very close to the road. As such, the flow is coming under here, and then this whole underbody can act to increase the downforce. Now, at this point in time in the history of aerodynamics, they weren't that adept at making the underbody produce a lot of downforce, but that is the general idea of this thing here. Now, in terms of the wheels, we can see that they do go to a very great length to actually make these aerodynamic, but it's not really that great. So for example, we can see that they covered half the wheels up with these what's called like a wheel spat. This is just like this covering, but they've covered half the wheel, but this bottom half is completely exposed, and you can see just how high from the ground this fairing is. That means you have all this air coming and hitting this front wheel, and that's producing a lot of drag. Compared to the Mercedes Vision EQXX, you can see just how far down this fairing comes. So there's a very little gap between the end of the fairing and the road. So there's not much of the wheel, the frontal area of the wheel, that's exposed to this high velocity. This is not the case for this wheel. We do have a lot of this wheel actually being exposed to the flow, which then increases the drag. So that is a negative here. The wheel spats are great, but that exposed frontal area is bad. On a side note, a good thing about this car is that you can see the rims are very well covered. Like, they're almost completely covered with a few slits coming out. That's for cooling flow. But having the rims completely covered, that is very good for drag. Now, in terms of the tire width, actually, compared to last week, we went through this car and I was saying how I'm pretty sure that these tires are a little bit narrower than most other tires, and that is not exactly the case here. Like, if we look at this picture here, we can see that this car in the back, which already has fairly narrow tires, they have, I reckon, a little bit wider on this car. So I don't think these tires are that narrow, which also then increases the drag a little bit more compared to the EQXX Mercedes. Now, another good thing that the Abarth has going for it is just how sharp the trailing edge is of the car. So that means that as the flow goes over the car, it then can converge at the back here, and there's no real wake that's forming just from this back area. Compared to the Mercedes, we will have the flow coming down here, the flow coming up, and we have this base pressure here, this base region, which has a wake. So that is where the Mercedes is actually worse than this car here in terms of the back. But this is done for styling purposes. Now, in terms of these different cars, this is a ICE, so it operates on combustion. It's not an electric car. This, on the other hand, is an electric car. That is actually quite a big deal, and for drag as well. So because this is an electric car, a petrol car or gas car, this has to have some cooling flow. Now, cooling flow means that you have air going along the car, and you have to suck in air from somewhere to then cool the engine. Now, that is usually going to result in some drag being produced, and depending on the car size and how much cooling flow you're taking in, it will change. So it ranges, but it's usually about like 5 to 10% of the car's drag coefficient. So the electric car, on the other hand, doesn't need this cooling flow, so we can save that drag there, and that's where the Mercedes has a big advantage over this Abarth. So this is a 0.17 drag coefficient. This is a 0.2 drag coefficient. If you take 5 to 10% off this, you're getting down to about 0.18, 0.19. So immediately right there, that cooling flow alone makes up much of the difference between the drag coefficient of this car and the drag coefficient of this car. So if you were to couple then all the other components compared to this car, you could easily get this drag coefficient down, but then again, that is a different type of car. One final thing I want to talk about is these wheel housings. So they might look very aerodynamic, but in fact, they're not really that aerodynamic when you think about it, because if you have, for example, here, they are fairly well blended, but still you do have some frontal area here that is exposed to the oncoming flow. That means you're going to have higher pressure here, and at the back here, okay, you will get a little bit more of a lower pressure. So that's going to result in this pressure difference between the front and back, and that's going to increase the drag of the car. And also I should note that one thing I forgot to mention is this little cutout in the top here. Now it doesn't look like much here, but if I go back to this picture, you can see that it is definitely a cutout. So that is also going to reduce the aerodynamics of this car and increase the drag. And with all these different components, it's easy to see how this car, even though it looks like it might be more aerodynamic in terms of drag than this car, it actually isn't. And if we were to get rid of this downforce reduction, if we were to cover these wheels completely, make these wheel houses more flat or like blend in better, and get rid of the petrol engine, the gas engine, and put in an electric engine, this car could very easily take this car in terms of the drag coefficient. So that is the end of the video. If you'd like to, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace, amigos.